Chapter 3: The Individual and the Catastrophe. As an accepted doctrine, man is the measure of all things requires some intellectual basis. If we ask, why is man the measure of all things? The answer is ready to hand. Because, it is suggested, he possesses in consciousness a quality which distinguishes him above all other created beings, and makes him the measure of creation. Understanding, reason, intelligence, use what term we will, is the strongest evidence of man's unique position, upon which his claim to be the measure of things is based. Man has become like one of us, he knows good and evil, as the creation myth in Genesis puts it. Become like one of us means that through his possession of consciousness man has become as God, he is now himself God, and, for that reason, the measure of all things. Consciousness in the human sense is usually regarded as a stable and self-existent faculty. Whether this faculty has developed in the course of the last few centuries, creating itself, as it were, in a mutation of the cerebrum, or whether it has always existed but its power been discovered only in recent centuries, is not very clear. In any case, a quality of self-existence is attributed to consciousness which justifies Western man's reliance upon it. He has, indeed, virtually staked his whole existence upon its supremacy. The validity of the belief, so vast in scope and importance, touches the deep mystery of man's being. Its nature is discussed more fully in a later chapter, here we need deal only briefly with the matter. Man is both more and less than the creation he sees around him. A being whose development has not yet been completed, he lacks perfect form, and is in that sense indefinable. Plants and animals, on the contrary, have reached a completed form, closely adjusted to the circumjacent world. They have so grown up with it that their inner life, their body, and the world without, constitute a three-in-oneness, an inseparable unity. Within natural creation plants and animals are at home. Man is not suited to the same extent to his environment. He stands outside the specialized perfection of animal instincts and bodily organs, and perceives in natural creation an alien opposite. The perception of the alien opposite gives rise to anguish, that primeval emotion which is essentially and peculiarly his. Man is the only being to suffer anguish, and it constitutes the anteroom to consciousness. Due to the fact that he has fallen out of the security of natural creation, it means division and weakness. Instead of the unity of inner world, body and outer world, the in each otherness in which plants and animals have remained, he experiences outside each otherness and oppositeness. This opposite is dark and unknown, a sinister principle which constrains man, by which he becomes obsessed, and by which he may be overpowered at any moment. His inner world is not directed by ingrained instincts, nor is his body provided with organs and faculties so adjusted to the external world as to offer him security of existence. He has to gain the world for himself, to earn it by hard work. In this settlement with the alien circumjacent world, two phenomena emerge which are peculiar to man and give him his unique position in creation: culture and consciousness. Culture is that part of the natural circumjacent world which man made his own and freed from anguish by hard work. Consciousness is that part of his natural inner world which man has gained by hard work, and freed from anguish. Culture and consciousness, then, cannot be separated, but mutually condition each other. When man perceives with anguish the dark and sinister opposite, he is already coming to terms with it, whether it assaults and overpowers him, or he actively advances and ventures to grasp it. He suffers it and is obsessed by it. Advancing upon the external world, or defending himself from its pressure, he experiences and apperceives it, and becomes conscious of his own self, active in it and suffering it. When he dares to grasp the opposite and bit by bit to make it his own, he is creating around and within him a freedom, delivered from anguish. Thus by a new man-made and labor-earned three-in-oneness, man attempts to win back the lost security of natural creation. This few and artificial, because man-made, three-in-oneness consists in the unity of consciousness, of instrument, and of culture, where the consciousness corresponds to the inner world, the instrument to the body, and the culture to the natural world outside. Man is thus conditioned by the fact that with one part of his being he has fallen out of creation's security, and must himself create the shell in which he can live and develop. As a fallen being, he is less than other living creatures, since he is unfinished and imperfect, while they are complete within the bounds of their own world. As a creative being, however, he is more than the created things around him, for with the phenomenal shapes of consciousness, of the instrument, and of culture, he introduces something new into the work of natural creation, a something beyond, which makes him an obsessive being, that is to say, the Lord of creation. Whence does he draw the power to maintain a contest with the world and free himself from anguish? Manifestly the something more is within. In direct opposition to plants and animals, he has retained free, unfettered, shape-giving powers which are oriented to the goal of his ultimate perfection. He is the one being who remains in a state of becoming and transformation, and is only to be understood as something in course of development towards an end. It is this not yet realized quality in him which constitutes the something beyond which distinguishes him from the rest of creation, and it is from this still unmortgaged inner surplus that the power of coming to terms with the world grows up. And yet his path through the millennia shows that it is not only by daring to set himself in opposition to creation and come to terms with it that he stands, but that he is supported by other forces. As part of a community he finds a certain amount of security and relief from anguish. All man's experiences and adventures, acts and behavior, as far back as we can trace, have a collective character, and are expressions of a society in which man does not yet exist as an individual, but functions as a member of a great body which includes within itself all his progenitors. This great body is like a beehive or an ant heap, it is inextricably interplated within itself and clamped together, and by dint of collective concentration and ratification it appoints from among itself separate individuals as leaders, who as priests or chiefs begin to show the outlines of man's image current among us today. The combination and joint strength of many men is needed to create the individual man. The individuals, priests, and chieftains whom the collective body has produced, function only as the organs of the collective body, which must regulate its behavior in accordance with the world around it. A being like man, who is still developing, depends wholly upon not losing his way, of keeping his goal in sight, for when he departs from the will of creation he is exposed to counterstrokes which may destroy him. Observing and regulating the collective body's behavior and its relationship with the world around it, and making its path sure, is the Tuscan function of the individuals, and only as they successfully achieve this do they obtain confirmation by the collective body. They do not therefore possess validity of themselves, but are valid only as mediators towards the dark opposite, face to face with which man finds himself. The priest or chieftain whom the collective body appoints as an individual, therefore, does not bear the features of a sovereign despot, but fulfills an important function and is charged with enormous responsibility. The collective body places the individual before the dark opposite which was originally everything in the world around man. The primal anguish must therefore have been enormous. To venture forward required something more than a response to the image of perfection towards which man is oriented. Indeed, the sense of imperfection is not self-explanatory, but arises from experience of another invisible but vital and effective power which he knows to be in possession of perfection. He perceives that he is working reciprocally with this power, is correlated to it, and that it affords him power when he stands in unison with it, and refuses itself to him whenever the relationship is broken off. This vital power men have named God. The whole process of coming to terms with the external world, through which culture and consciousness arose, took place in the course of men's struggle around the godly opposite, and with the help of the strength which flowed into him when he set himself in unison with the opposite. Thus all culture had from its inception a sacramental character, and is indistinguishable from the cult. Behind everything, tree, stream, plant, or animal, the godly opposite was hidden. The thing itself was only an allegory. The godly opposite was reality. One can therefore say that man's circumjacent world has been given him, and freed from anguish, by God alone. The individual whose task was to maintain the relationship of the collective body with the godly opposite acted only as a mediator who interpreted the signs and transmitted instructions. The separation of the functions of priest and chieftain marks the attainment of a certain degree of liberty. The security and behavior of the collective body inside the area it had made its own presented new tasks, and the functions of chieftain and priest emerged, the former possessing the power and the second the authority. The more the area of man's freedom extends, the more does the godly opposite lift himself out of the things in the world around and leave them to man. At the same time, however, the godly opposite increases in clarity as an image, until it concentrates itself into the figure of a god. Thus the godly opposite does not merely bring to man the strength for the appropriation of the external world, but reveals itself to man ever more clearly in the process. Man placed as an individual before the opposite that is the one living God, intent on drawing near to him in reciprocal working, in order to attain the perfection of his nature and the peace of existence. This is the only meaning which the development of man has revealed so far. It is as much as man knows of himself and the task allotted to him. To the external possession of man is culture, its internal mirror image is consciousness. Inner and outer are complementary and inseparable. Man's consciousness is conditioned by the image of the world well earned and made his own. If the meaning of human development is that individual man, placed before the living opposite, should approach the full perfection of his nature, then culture and consciousness can only be fluid quantities, representing no reality of their own, but providing a means to an end. This is clear from the very fact that neither of them overlaps completely the whole of the outer and inner world. Culture is not identical with the world, nor is being conscious identical with the being of man. Around the world conditioned by culture and consciousness lies that other dark and unknown world which man encounters as a nameless and shapeless opposite. At any moment this world may break into the area of culture and consciousness with destructive force, and the old anguish may recur. Such an eruption may come from without, from the world of natural creation, and annihilate man's artificial world. It can also come from within, from man's being, and flood out the area of his consciousness, thereby destroying his culture. From the recognition of this position man has always concluded that he cannot make his existence wholly dependent upon culture and consciousness, but needs another basis. Hence he has sought to bend his freedom to the power which he sensed as godly and knew to be as vital in the world of nature as in the hidden depths of his own being. At the peak point of human development man leaves culture and consciousness behind him and betakes himself into the realm of the not yet realized, where, stripped of all things, he can draw near to the power opposite him. It is only in this phase of human development, when the individual takes station before his godly opposite, that the something more and something beyond which have been plotted out in man are realized, producing a change in his nature. The path into the untried, which begins at the peak of the human hierarchy, is marked out by all religions, which can, in consequence, never regard culture and consciousness as reality, but only as an allegory. This truth finds clearest expression in the 3 stages of the classical Indian scheme of learning. The young Brahmin was until the age of about 20 educated by a Brahmin. As a man he then devoted himself until the age of about 45 to the things of this world. He founded a family, attended to his profession, and developed culture and consciousness. Thereafter, however, he cut himself free from his past life and betook himself as a hermit into the forests, or attached himself to some monastery, in order to devote himself to his own development. The Christian faith has also been indifferent to the things pertaining to culture and consciousness, since the kingdom of God, to which it is directed, lies on the far side of earthly activity. Therefore the Christian, too, can look upon culture and consciousness as an allegory, possessed of value only as they help to set the individual before God. As culture and consciousness grow, however, the temptation for man to put them on a level with the whole of the world and of being, and to attribute to them a right and reality of their own, increases. The feeling for the godly opposite fades out, and with it the image of unattained perfection. Culture no longer points to something beyond, needing to be realized, but calls attention to itself, and affirms the consciousness of man who created it. The view that man has reached the end of the path, as a perfected being, would become acceptable. Being and being conscious would coincide in the same way as creation and culture, and man would attain the peace and security of a state of being in which there are no more anguish. He would have returned to that three-in-oneness out of which he had emerged. The temptation is greatest when culture and consciousness have developed to a point where they actually embrace a large part of the world and of mankind, so that man's sense of anguish is dimmed, his watchfulness slumbers, and his knowledge of his limitations becomes blurred. He finds himself in a world so shaped by the collective efforts of innumerable generations that it ceases to be alien and hostile, and gives him security. Losing its mediatory and allegorical character, and no longer pointing to the other world, it receives, by a procedure into which we shall have to inquire more closely, the power to confirm man by itself alone. It tells him, you daughter you, and removes the metaphysical uncertainty and lack of security of his being. Placed in a world which is divested of its darkness and mystery, he loses the feeling of his imperfection, be with it he loses also his connection with that perfected being opposite him, and his knowledge of the meaning of existence. If culture and consciousness were truly qualities existing by their own right and capable of maintaining themselves as autonomous realities, this procedure would not be important. Man would then simply remain at the altitude he had reached, and would himself have become a stable being. But culture and consciousness are unstable qualities, neither existent by their own strength nor borne up by the will of creation. They depend upon man's power to bear them and nourish them, and they collapse the moment that his power begins to relax. And the power does begin to fade the instant that man ascribes to it a real existence and hangs his own existence upon it. For this inner energy was not directed towards culture and consciousness, but towards the godly opposite, whom man was seeking to approach more closely. The measure of what was moving in man was greater and more important than the sum total of actual toil, which was really nothing but the transit station. If he makes the whole of his existence dependent upon the pseudo-reality of culture, he is drawing his strength from the works which he himself has created, and which demand of him the power for their maintenance. Lest we get the vicious circle that what demands man's strength in order to be maintained, has first to give him the strength to carry out the task. Once man has gotten into that vicious circle, the decline of culture and consciousness begins. The decline will not be apparent while man can still draw liberally from the reservoir of strength the preceding generations have stored up, but the collapse is swift and catastrophic when the reserves become low. The essential being of man, which is centered upon a different image of perfection from any that consciousness can show it, will set itself upon the defensive. It will not only withdraw the psychic energies it has previously supplied to man, but will turn those energies against the partial image of man and of the world which is presented to him as being the ultimate reality. Man will thus become a split being. As a conscious being, he will cling to the world of his culture, because it bears him and affirms him, but at the same time, as a being unconscious and held a prisoner of being, he will store within himself forces which turn against culture, and will strive ever harder to be free of it, because it impedes the image of his nature's perfection deep within him. Thus, in constituting himself sole master of creation and measure of all things, man prepares for his decline, a catastrophe more or less serious in proportion to the height of the culture concerned. It is a catastrophe, however, only from the viewpoint of the world of culture and consciousness, both of which will be destroyed and reconstructed. From the standpoint of true being, it is only an allegory, pointing to the renewal of the human image and the reemergence of the godly opposite. The closer man gets to the goal of his perfection, the greater the risks he runs, since temptation rises equally. Religious tradition has preserved the knowledge that every form of culture must end in catastrophe, that the catastrophe must occur at the culture's peak point, and that the higher the peak, the more violent must be the catastrophe. Even the Christian view of history takes this into account, for at the end of historical development it makes Antichrist appear, to whom power is given to produce signs and work wonders for the tempting of man. And all men will turn to him, save for a small residue who remain strong and await the due end of history and the transformation of the world and of man. Independently of truths found in our religious heritage, profane historical tradition chronicles the same phenomenon. Humanity has produced an imposing number of high cultures, which have always displayed at the peak points of their developments the same process of decline and collapse. Substituting culture and consciousness for creation and being, and losing the faculty of wisely apperceiving the godly opposite, man could no longer maintain himself and his works. 3. The causes of historical catastrophe can be more closely defined. Human development served and conditioned by culture and consciousness has so far possessed the single meaning, that of making manifest the stature of the living God, and of setting man as an individual free from threats and danger from his environment in front of this opposite. We may therefore infer that the peculiar transformation of man and the perfecting of his being will only be fully realized within the limits of that polarity and in reciprocal action between God and the individual soul. The figure of the individual thereby becomes of paramount significance. The whole vast course of human development, with its enormous sacrifices and sufferings, would have served the single end of creating the individual, and putting him before the opposite of the one God, and it would only be through him, the individual, that man draws closer to the goal of his journey. The human species would in that case present the image of a natural hierarchy, a pyramid, at the peak of which would stand the individual. But this elevation of the individual man, which must make him giddy, is compensated by an equally enormous afflation. For the collective body created the individual solely as an organ of the community, to observe, to regulate, and to guarantee its relationship with the godly opposite, and not as a persona existent by his own right. It is immensely daring in man as an individual to fix his eyes upon the godly opposite. It is a stupendous destiny to fall into the hands of the living God and be committed to the task of transforming one's own being. Confirmation by the collective body, and the tradition of the means and culture and consciousness, raised the individual to a height from whence he dared direct his gaze upon the living opposite, and it was only as a means to this end that they saved him. They did not of themselves confirm him. At the height of the process of development where man knows himself as an incomplete and imperfect being, there can be no confirmation. There is only knowledge of the whole insecurity and lostness of man's being, the experience of the metaphysical uncertainty of his existence, and the inner perception of being born by an unseen power, which will perhaps manifest itself to him, and to which he will perhaps approach closer. The individual recognizes the whole imperfection and insecurity of man, and it is only through this immensely painful experience that the preconditions for a genuine change in man are established, and man can advance towards his goal. The individual is strongly tempted to withdraw from the suffering, and, in place of the scanty moments of an affirmation of himself, accorded by the invisible godly opposite, to which his own inner experience acts as a mediator, to substitute a permanent affirmation by the visible opposite of his culture, which accords him the greatest measure of power and freedom. In the world of culture man becomes to a great extent independent of nature and the cosmos, which no longer meet him as something alien and hostile, but assume the character of reality without pointing onwards to the godly opposite. It is always the world of cities which accords man the fullest measure of such security, through his enclosure in the shell of a greater community. The city was also originally directed towards God, from the tutelary deities of the heathen world, whose temples dominated it, to the Christian God, whose cathedrals stretched to heaven. But it seems to exist by its own laws, independently of the laws of creation, defended by its walls from the circumjacent world of nature, covered under its roofs from cosmic space, hidden in its homes, and from youth upwards accustomed to the traffic of its streets and ready-made artificial structures, man meets step by step, and as on equal terms, a world which has lost its allegorical character, which begins to be an independent opposite to him, and affords him self-consciousness. Whereas the godly opposite will bring him the full realization of his insecurity and incompleteness, and thereby expose him, until he achieves the inner sense of being born, to the whole torment of the developmental process. This visible opposite are him a self-assured ego and a knowledge of the end to which sent is living. That is to say, all that marks the deficiency in man, it assures him, is a sign of his completeness. Here must, however, first have been a certain transformation in man himself. Culture certainly sets him in a circumstantial world, which he possesses, instead of being possessed by it, and enormously increases his power and freedom, but in itself it is dead and lacks the power of affirmation. So long as man lives as an individual in the world of culture, its values remain a means to an end, and an allegory. Tohim. Set alone on a desert island, and surrounded by all the works of culture, man could not do otherwise than see them as instrumental and allegorical, and make use of them in that sense. He would forthwith discover that they do not possess any value in themselves, but point to something else. The individual is exactly like a solitary being on an uninhabited island. The process in the individual which has changed him and his relationship to God must have its cause. The individual cannot affirm himself, but has to display himself and whatever is his to one opposite, in order to obtain the needed affirmation. Only then and thereby does he become real. And since as an individual he first received his affirmation from the godly opposite alone, he must afterwards have found a different opposite which accorded him the desired confirmation, and thereby made of culture and consciousness for matter of reality to him. In addition to his direction upon the godly opposite, the individual possesses a secondary kind of affirmation, which alone makes his function possible. He takes his origin from the communal effort and the affirmation of the collective body, which for its own weight created in him the function of establishing and maintaining connection with the godly opposite, the strength which the affirmation of the collective body gave him, and which alone made his individualized existence possible and created the image of man, was for him only relative, inasmuch as he himself was only functioning as a mediator, placed before the godly opposite and charged with the task of the collective body. He could not attribute the affirmation to himself or relate it to himself. The relationship alters only when the individual fails in his task, turns away from his godly opposite, and now ascribes the confirmation by the collective body to himself. When he accordingly ceases to be a mediator, a persona. With this procedure at the apex of the human hierarchy, man's particular fall has taken place, and at the same moment the individual ceases to exist, having reincorporated himself in the collective body from which he took his origin. Only now do culture and consciousness become realities and lose their mediatory and allegorical character, for the fallen individual has found in the collective body a different opposite to whom he can show them, and whose confirmation he can now obtain himself. This return and renunciation frees him from the torment of his unprotected and incomplete state. With confirmation by the collective body, everything becomes easy and everything makes sense. Culture and consciousness become values in themselves, and, set before the concave mirror of the collective body, appear as visible and palpable reality. The decline of culture and the blurring of human consciousness begin, therefore, with the fall of the individual. They take their start from the peak of the hierarchy, and are characterized by the individual deriving his confirmation from below instead of from above. And with the return of the individual into the collective body, the collective body is deprived of the direction he provided. It therefore resembles a large body without eyes, which, running about at random, inevitably gets hurt in the process. The catastrophe of every human community begins with the fading out of the individual. The catastrophe always follows the same course. When the individual bases himself upon culture and consciousness and gives them reality through the confirmation of the collective body, he indirectly expresses the belief that the goal of human development has been reached in him. An image and an aim are thus displayed to every member of the collective body, which each one must realize for himself. The aim is not placed very high. Possession of those visible and tangible values upon which the men at the peak of the hierarchy have based their existence is all that is required. Once a man possesses these, he will participate in the same confirmation, and with it acquire the same degree of certainty and security, freedom and power. Thus we get the paradoxical procedure of man affirming the reality and value of culture in order to derive from it the confirmation of his own reality and value. As a result of this procedure, a struggle begins in the collective body for the visible and tangible values of culture. The existing values are not sufficient to be made equally accessible to everyone. So values, which originally had only an allegorical importance, are multiplied and reproduced and replaced by ever worse copies and imitations. There is thus a lowering of values within the framework of the collective body, and this goes on at an ever-increasing tempo as more and more people succeed in claiming a share of the pseudo-reality. But the lowering of values also results in a decline in the power of confirmation by the collective body, for at a certain level the lowered values become quite meaningless, being available to everybody. They lose their quality of rarity, and, since they can only be made available in reproductions, slip from the level of quality onto that of quantity. Confirmation of social position by the collective body then loses its quality of grace and becomes valueless, and man has no means to secure his confirmation. It is a terrifying situation, since it takes him back to the initial insecurity, that old primeval anguish, from which he had painfully detached himself on his millennial journey. It is an anguish of utter gloom, containing no opposite, where man must wait for the lost godly opposite to manifest itself. Again, driven to the limit of horror, he inflicts upon himself and others the most gruesome suffering. No means or too frightful, no acts too shameful, to recover what has been withdrawn, the awareness of the self. Since confirmation by the body collective threatens to fade out in a general collapse of value, new and abnormal values have to be created, and their recognition enforced by fear. The abasement of other persons becomes the only means of confirmation for oneself. Terror and despotism arise. The abasement of the other man, however, renders the effort hopeless, for it devalues the confirmation which has been extorted from him. Abased to a thing of naught, he is no longer capable of reassuring his oppressor. The lust for blood, which is at all times an anguish intoxication, ends in quantity superseding quality. 4. The collapse of culture and the darkening of consciousness may lead to the virtual destruction of the collective body. World history offers examples enough of this. The degenerative process reaches its limits at the point where the individual appears again and manifests the living reality of the godly opposite. From that point where he went astray, man must retrace his steps and work out his path anew. He must go the way of expiation, repentance, asceticism, and rebirth. It is a path for the individual, and the individual is known by his readiness to admit and to accept the blame as his own. It is the admission of his own guilt which subordinates him again to the opposite, and thereby makes him a persona once more. But it is precisely here that the most difficult part of a new beginning lies. In what way can the relationship with the godly opposite be re-established if the individual no longer exists, but has been absorbed into the collective body? The catastrophe has to be recognized as such before a change in man becomes possible. But it is precisely this which is hidden from him. The true nature of the catastrophe is apparent to the man who lives alongside but outside it, and can observe it as an external event, either because he belongs to an alien body collective, or because he has studied deeply some historic catastrophe. But to the man who is struck by it unawares, it appears as something dark and unknown. So small is his understanding of it, that for a long time, possibly right to the bitter end, he is unaware of being in the midst of catastrophe at all. It refutes the thesis that being and being conscious, culture, and creation, are coincident, upon which his whole existence is based. Not only are its material consequences unpleasant, therefore, but it contradicts and convulses the whole metaphysical basis of his existence by contradicting it. He has to free himself from the culture and that consciousness, which have become a reality through collective confirmation, and submit to the dark and unknown pressing in upon him from the realm of being or of natural creation, which can only be lived and experienced directly. He has to present himself a nameless one to the nameless opposite. The strength to venture upon such a course is not generally possessed by the man who has been living certain and secure. It may grow within him through catastrophe, if the latter takes away and smashes one after another the props of his existence, for in so doing it liberates submerged vital forces. At the beginning of the catastrophe, however, the necessary strength is lacking. So long as it is at all possible, he will therefore endeavor to pass judgment upon the other and the alien from the ground he knows. Seeking to incorporate it in the usual trusted categories of his consciousness and his culture. He will describe it in terms and concepts to which he is accustomed, as the crisis, the revolution, the historical change, which can in no wise do justice to the true meaning and nature of what is happening, but help to postpone the shattering of human consciousness. In this situation man is stricken with blindness, desperately trying to maintain the old foundations of his existence, and incapable of acknowledging that consciousness is growing darker and darker in the struggle, leading to ever more ridiculous interpretations of events. His inability to incorporate what is happening in his consciousness leaves events shapeless and becoming ever more dangerous, while consciousness becomes increasingly dark as the external supports of existence are removed. The force of events may in the end drive him to admit that he is in the midst of a catastrophe, but so long as he attributes reality to the catastrophe, the admission belongs to the ancient categories of his thought. If he concedes it reality, and a man who is sure of himself is accustomed to see nothing but reality around him, having lost his eye for the mediatory and allegorical character of the world, he is left to face the consequence either by preparing for his own annihilation, or voluntarily courting it, for which reason the death urges at this stage want to predominate strongly in the collective body. Knowledge of being in a state of catastrophe is thus not given directly to man, and in his blindness he is capable of going to the extreme point of annihilation without becoming aware of his position. Without doubt he would have a chance of escape only after recognizing the causes of the catastrophe and working out for himself picture of its nature and meaning. And this is not possible so long as the catastrophe is regarded as a reality. The urge to seek out the causes begins only when man recognizes that as a reality it is indifferent, casual, and unreal, even though it leads to violent destruction and immense sacrifices over the rubble and ruins of the destruction, and over the graves and crosses of the annihilated. A kind of comfortless boredom hangs so long as they have not become an allegory, that is to say, so long as the catastrophe does not point beyond and through itself to that other and alien which is giving signs through it. And this would already presuppose a change in the man, the elaboration and acquisition of some conceptual world. The catastrophe destroys the things on which man depends and on which he has based his existence. Where his existence has become completely dependent on these things, it destroys man himself. This is its meaning and purpose. In order to perceive this, man has to renounce voluntarily the things which, willy-nilly, are being taken from him. To perceive this allegorical quality of the event would necessarily mean man perceiving his own guilt and admitting it in repentance. Therefore perception of the crisis is the prerequisite of a change in man. Man recognizes the occurrence only to the extent to which he himself changes. And this change is at the same time the only means of influencing the occurrence and averting the catastrophe. A procedure of this kind is never completed within the collective body. It is, of course, possible through the length and gravity of the catastrophe to awaken within the collective body the will for redemption from anguish, and start a search for the individual who can give the resolution form and direction. We know the call for the saint and redeemer went up throughout the Roman world long before the occurrence which took place on Jewish soil. While such longing prepares the ground, it cannot realize itself, for the concepts of guilt, repentance, and retribution are bound up with conscience, and conscience in its turn is active in the individual alone, and entirely suspended in the collective body. The catastrophe of the collective body, which began with the event played out between God and the individual, can only be removed by an event played out anew between God and the individual. And this event begins with the man who dares apprehend the causes of the Catastrophe as in some way bound up with his own guilt. In him the individual is born anew. 5. Man is the measure of all things because he has been given in consciousness a faculty which distinguishes him from all other creatures. So runs the thesis upon which the man of the West has based his life since the Italian Renaissance. The investigation so far conducted suggests that with the acceptance of this thesis, the fall within culture occurs, and, as a consequence, the way to catastrophe is inescapable. This was a far-reaching conclusion, for the Renaissance marked the birth of modern European man. It created a type of man still representative of all people within European cultural circles, and put into circulation values and ideas which remain holy and sacrosanct. In the course of half a millennium's development, Renaissance man has not merely become a lively prototype for all social strata in the West, particularly the lower strata, which accepted it last, but, by virtue of the proselytizing power of Western ideas, has gone farther and become representative of the whole world, which it now dominates. The path to catastrophe would thus not only be followed by the people of the West, but throughout the world. As the cradle of modern man, the Renaissance is surrounded by an aura of glittering brilliance, which repels all criticism. And in very deed a factual consideration of it was not possible so long as man was absorbed by the historical development which it began. Only in the last few decades has Western man been freeing himself from this dependence, and in proportion as he is able to do so, and to survey an expired historic period, his criticism of it increases. How does the phenomenon look, not measured, as it has been hitherto, by its own concepts and ideas, but by the yardstick of the fall and the catastrophe? To base the thesis that man is the measure of all things upon consciousness is erroneous, because consciousness is a fluid quantity. It is not a serviceable organ given to man, like his heart or lungs, but is the reflection of his external circumjacent world which he has acquired by work, and freed from anguish. Renaissance man in his urban security resembles the citizens in the flowering time of Greek life 2000 years earlier, after the repulse of the Persians, when the sophist Protagoras coined the phrase man is the measure of all things, and so became the spokesman of Greek enlightenment. The open space of the city frees man from the darkness and uncertainty of his surroundings. Each step he takes has been taken innumerable times before. His environment has been prepared for him by long generations, and he feels that he has no need himself to test things, but merely to take them over. It is the liberty afforded by the environment which provides the basis for his consciousness. Before long, however, he advances from that well-secured world of his possession and rule, into the yet unconquered outer world and subjects it to limitations similar to those valid within the city walls. For this he needs an image of nature and the cosmos, such as divests them of their mysterious qualities, and makes them into human possessions. Both are necessarily deprived of their live quality before they can be given as objects into the man's possession. The task was undertaken in the world of Greece by Protagoras' fellow countryman and contemporary, Democritus. Nature, Democritus taught, does not exist, there are only voids and atoms, moving in accordance with definite laws. The cosmos is a gigantic mechanism, where everything happens under the compulsion of necessity. Within its operations the gods have no place, for they are subject to the same laws, and scarcely differentiated from men. Democritus therefore speaks disapprovingly of men who to embellish their own unreason have thought up a lying picture of chance, and deceive themselves with mendacious tales about a life after death. Man no longer finds the cosmos and nature opposite him, filled with godly or demonic powers, and his life is no longer bound up with their vital forces, which he perceives within himself and knows to be at work. He has superimposed the image of the town onto natural creation, turning it into a gigantic piece of lifeless mechanism with stones moved and whirled around each other in accordance with the law of mass. Man himself would be like a helpless stone whirled around by causality did he not own creation as an object in his consciousness. He himself, as subject and carrier of this consciousness, is the sole living being within the entire mechanism, having a power of insight into the brazen laws of the whole. He is subject to the same laws as all other pieces of matter, but he is a thinking piece of matter, and when he recognizes the laws under which he himself and the whole of the universe have their being, he is above them, and can look down on the whole mechanism like God. Human consciousness of its own volition has thus moved into the place of God. Democritus and Protagoras need each the other, just as do mechanicism and rationalism. In Greek development their teachings were a brief episode. 2,000 years later, however, they experienced a rebirth which determined the destiny of the West and of the world generally up to today. The inhabitants of Genoa, Florence, and Venice lived in the same world surroundings and amid the same conditions as the citizens of Athens, Miletos, and Ephesus 2,000 years earlier. As men of an elevated city culture, they were exposed to similar temptations, and the practical expedients at their disposal were not notably bigger than those of men 2,000 years before. What did constitute a real difference was the changed assumptions due to the Christian religion. The later European citizen bore the imprint of Christ's teaching, through the direct relationship between his soul and the Creator of heaven and earth. He was separated from nature and the cosmos, and elevated above them both. The realm of grace devalued that of nature, and over the course of many generations man was trained to free himself from natural creation and orient himself upon the supernatural aim of becoming perfect and complete. The expectation of his own impending transformation filled him with dynamic power. The teachings of Democritus and Protagoras thus fell upon soil which had been religiously prepared and was charged with mighty power. It was Christ's teaching which set man as an individual before God. The mighty elevation of man's personality played no part in his relation to the opposite. He could not compare himself with the power before whom he was placed and whose authority was binding upon him. Man's existence hung solely upon the bond between himself as an individual and God. If the bond broke, or man succeeded in releasing himself from it, something unique in human history was bound to occur. To yield upon that height to temptation must inevitably evoke an unprecedented catastrophe. This is the cardinal point of the Renaissance. It is there that one must look for the development of Western man, and there lie the causes of world events today. The representative man of the West is perfectly aware that he has found other foundations than religion for his existence. He meets any reference to the reality of God with uninterested patience, arising from complete aloofness. The history of the last 500 is dominated by an increasing destruction of man's belief in God, which in the 19th century began to affect the lower social strata, and today has become quite general. This breach with tradition springs from the fall of the individual, who at the height of culture falls back into the collective body and depends upon it for confirmation of his value. The individual thereby ceases to exist, and as the extrusion and death of the individual always betoken the beginning of catastrophe for the collective body, the history of our epoch presents the movement of the West, and of the whole world with it, so far as gripped and influenced by it, into catastrophe. It is occurring, like the increasing speed of falling bodies, more quickly as greater masses join the movement. Among the advantages of a confirmation by the collective body is the replacement of the invisible and impalpable godly opposite, only to be apprehended through an inner experience, by the visible and palpable reality of culture, which at once provides man with a different measure of security. Man, who has hitherto only had a knowledge of his ignorance before the godly opposite, and thereby a consciousness that is subordinate to being, now obtains from the reality of culture a consciousness which is certain of itself. The concrete affirmation of his own self means for the individual what is practically a liberation from the woes of his insecurity and imperfectness. As a consequence, he appears during the experience the very image of security and completeness, of overflowing health and strength. It is this image which until recently has been the dominant conception about the Renaissance, and has afforded the leadership image for modern man. It is consequently extremely difficult for the moderns to understand that the individual fell back into the collective body, instead of rising above it. If there is one thing accepted without question, it is that the free autonomous personality of man had its birth at the Renaissance. This free autonomous personality, labeled uomo singolare, uomo unico, uomo universale, universal man, and glorified as a second Adam, this man who felt himself to be the highest grade of human development, has been described by Jacob Burckhardt in a passage of his Culture of the Renaissance, written with the enthusiasm of the direct descendant. In the Middle Ages, both sides of consciousness, that towards the world and that towards man's innermost being, lay as if dreaming or but half awake beneath a single veil, woven of faith, childish prejudice and folly. Seen through it, the world's history appeared wondrously tinted. Man, however, only knew himself as race, people, party, corporate body, family, or in some other generalized form. It was in Italy that the veil first blew away, and in objective consideration and treatment of the state and the things of this world generally began. Man became an intellectual individual and recognized himself as such. With the end of the 13th century, Italy began to swarm with personalities. The ban which had been laid upon individualism was completely broken. Thousands of individuals were specializing themselves. Such is the picture of the new man, still valid for us today when we conjure up the figures of mighty lords, regents, and condottieri, of big bankers, merchants, and citizens, and the persona of humanity. Learned persons, artists, and literati, who at that time were producing developments on an extravagant scale and laying the foundations whereon we were standing until yesterday. The picture is sufficiently impressive to mislead one into Burckhardt's judgment, that the individual was then born in the West. To know what kind of a man was born then, and whether he really was an individual who looked upon the light of a new age, lived fully in his freedom, and felt a huge appetite for a living, one has to ascertain from whence he obtained his confirmation or the affirmation of his personality. He obtained it from the collective body. He obtained it by presenting himself, his actions, his works, and everything cultural which he was able to make his own, to the collective body, and being confirmed by that body. It is curious that a man like Burckhardt, who clearly saw the catastrophes approach, who was expecting none except ascetic personalities to be saved, and who in talking of the Renaissance described several phenomena really characteristic of the swing of the individual towards the collective body, should not have drawn the obvious conclusion, that this was the death, not the birth of the individual. For this far-famed and oft-praised individuality of the Renaissance, which appears to have sprung from its own inner strength, listens in a state of anguish to its audience, and waits tensely, like an actor, for the applause, anxious to see how many curtains it is called to take. With Renaissance individualism, the marks of collective approval became supreme values. The condottiere is hungry for his statue, the poet for his laurels, the man of literature for his applause. Vanities which depend upon the body collective are multiplied. The ostentation of possessions and the glitter of education are broadcast in biographies and mirrored in autobiographies. Man does not exist out of his own self at all, but has simply changed his opposite, his public. Moment by moment he exhibits himself before the body collective, and it is their business to pour out applause and make him real. For it is only through this confirmation that the role he plays acquires reality. For this purpose he must have something to display, property or education, that is to say, he must have made as much as possible of existing culture his own. He must have some skill to gain the applause of the body collective, just like the music hall artist who dances along the tightrope. And only when this having and being able have been confirmed by the applause of the body collective, is being accorded to the man, only then he is something. Here is the cardinal point of the Renaissance, the cause of all that has been happening subsequently in the West and beyond. In the Greek world, the theses of Democritus and Protagoras, about the world consisting of atoms and man being the measure of all things, were unable to strike any lasting roots. Plato, as the final comment on them, inserted the following stern sentence in his Laws: "The measure of all things is God." But when the theses reappeared in our Western world, the energy stored up by Christianity led to a unique transformation of man and his world, and the possibility of the most enormous catastrophe of history. Descartes put the final touch to the development with his famous cogito, ergo sum. That is to say, man is in possession of his consciousness, therefore he exists. Being and being conscious cover each the other, and are identical. It is only from consciousness that man can build himself a world of his own, the regnum hominis of Francis Bacon, which was in its own way identical with natural creation, so that culture, too, overlaps with the world. Man has thus really become Lord and Creator of heaven and earth, and set himself in the place of God. He has become a man God.